Hi everyone. Sorry, there's a big pause there. I didn't realise that that's the millennial pause, isn't it? I am an elder millennial. I'll start properly. Hi everybody. This is the video for the two introductions to the songs of Innocence and of Experience. In the videos that we're doing, what we're aiming to do is to take either one Blake poem or a pair of Blake poems and just examine the sorts of things you might say about those poems, either in a 20-mark question if the poem came up by itself, or as part of a wider answer about Blake in a 40-mark question. So during the course of the video, we'll look at both poems, we'll look at some context with Blake, we'll look at some critical views, we'll look at some examples of how you might write about Blake, we'll look at some examples of AO2. So all of it is designed to just kind of help you revise these poems in particular. So I'll start straight away, and here's kind of maybe the first place that we're going to begin, which is to have a look at these poems as introductions to the collection. So we've got the Songs of Innocence and of Experience. We'll start with some context. So on the screen there, you can see the slide that I used in the lesson last year, and you've got the two different title pages that Blake created for this. On the left, you've got Blake's first kind of go at this, which is just the Songs of Innocence. If you remember from last year, the context that's quite important here is that Blake wrote the Songs of Innocence in 1789, and he produced the Songs of Innocence by themselves without the Songs of Experience. Then he produced the Songs of Innocence and of Experience in full later in 1794. So Blake's in his early 30s when he's doing all of this. Just as a little bit of contextual kind of knowledge, it's probably important to remember a couple of things. First of all, that some critics say that Blake wrote all of these Songs of Innocence, these children's poems about the glory of God and how beautiful the world is, and then in 1789 the French Revolution happened and it changed Blake's worldview, and he then went back to it and kind of improved it with the Songs of Experience. That is kind of a fairly widespread critical view. I'm not sure I buy it, because Blake was already a radical before the French Revolution. It's not like the French Revolution surprised him into radicalism. Blake had already been brought up a radical. So I don't think the French Revolution radicalised him, and I think it's just because of that date, 1789, being historically convenient. The French Revolution did, of course, influence Blake, but it influenced him because he was already thinking these things about the nature of freedom and the nature of political repression and rebellion and those sorts of things. So I suspect that he wrote the Songs of Innocence first, for sure, but he probably had some sort of idea that he was going to then modify them and do the Songs of Experience later. The songs are too interrelated for him to have just kind of done all the Experience ones later. So that's just kind of my view contextually, which might be helpful. But it's useful to think of the Songs of Experience as more radical. It's useful to think of them as more adult, maybe, if we want to think about that, but not necessarily as like improvements on the Songs of Innocence, more of kind of like an inevitable companion piece. So that's the first thing to think about for context. The second thing to think about for context is the Songs of Innocence seem to have been written about children and for children. Not that they weren't for adults too, because obviously any children's writer is also indirectly writing for adults as well, because you're looking at, like, you know, parents reading, often reading to their children, or at least reading what their children are reading. So that's what we've got with the Songs of Innocence and of Experience. We're going to start with the introduction to the Songs of Innocence, and moving from AO3 now to maybe thinking about kind of the bread and butter of everything, which is the AO1 and the AO2. And these are the two questions I asked you last year when we looked at the Songs of Innocence and the introduction. Who's the speaker of the poem? What's happening in it? And what imagery is Blake using? So just to kind of summarise that a little bit, I think with Blake, he is a writer that uses voices, isn't he? And so when I appears in a Blake poem, On a Cloud I Saw a Child, it's worth separating that out from the biographical William Blake, and to often see the speaker of the poem and the construct of Blake. So what sort of speaker of the poem have we got here? What sort of construct of Blake have we got? Well, this person is a bard and a singer and a musician, isn't he? Because he's wandering around the wild valleys piping and playing songs. So that you might feel that that character is very similar to what we know about William Blake as a person instead, but it's still worth thinking about that character being a construct of Blake the writer, because it helps us to write about, it helps us to kind of analyse the poem if we do it that way. So we've got a speaker of the poem who is a piper. He is being presented as being somebody who's one with nature because he's in the valleys playing these songs. And the story of this poem is that this piper is kind of piping down the wild valleys, and then he sees a cloud on a child. Sorry, he doesn't. He sees a child on a cloud, and the child on the cloud proceeds to give this piper a series of instructions. Piper song about a lamb is the first line of the second stanza, and the piper obeys. I piped with no cheer. Drop thy pipe, sing thy songs in the third stanza. And again, the piper obeys the child. I sung the same again. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. And then the third kind of injunction from the child, he vanishes, and the writer, or the piper becomes a writer. So there's a little progressive story where the child on the cloud is asking kind of three things of this piper. First to play the songs, then to sing the songs, then to write down the songs in a book. And it's worth kind of seeing this as a kind of introduction to the Songs of Innocence, of like, this is maybe what the Songs of Innocence are. These songs in this book are in this book because I was told to write them down by this kind of angelic child. Just in general, in terms of your arguments and linking your arguments to AO3, it's worth thinking about the fact that this is, as always for Blake, reasonably unusual, reasonably radical for children's literature. So at the time Blake was writing, at the early 18th century, or the kind of late 18th century, literature for children was often highly religious, and it was often kind of very, very didactic, which means telling them what to do. Like, children's literature was often, you behave like this, otherwise you're in big trouble from your parents and God and everybody else. Now we know that Blake sees the world differently, and I think this song embodies Blake's worldview, because in this song the child is telling the adult what to do, and the adult's job is to obey the child in that way. The child's creativity is being celebrated, as is the speaker's creativity, and that's again sets the tone for the Songs of Innocence, doesn't it? That like creativity and freedom are the watchwords here. This child does not have to obey a set of moral rules or laws handed down by adults or by God. This child is the kind of active force in the poem. Just looking at some of the imagery is quite simple, isn't it? So it's worth thinking about kind of how you might talk about it. So first of all, throughout this poem, you've got the imagery of creativity, haven't you? And you've got different versions of creativity, from playing the musical instrument, piping a song, then singing, and then writing. And you might want to see those things as developmental. So the imagery here is that the creativity gets more complex, mirroring maybe the development of a child. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of how that imagery is working. Children might respond first of all to just music, then children might respond to hearing words sung, and then later children might respond to kind of the written word. So the imagery of creativity is connected to kind of child's development in the poem. I think also it's worth looking at, again, fairly common with Blake, the pastoral imagery throughout this poem. So we know that Blake loves to use that image of the lamb, and it's not a coincidence, is it, that the child asks him to pipe a song about a lamb. Every time there's a lamb in Blake's poem, he likes that image because it links us to Christ, it links us to the idea of sacrifice, it links us to the idea of childhood innocence. A lamb is those three things always. A lamb is always kind of closely related to both children and to Christ, and Blake wants to always make that idea clear that lambs, children and Christ are intimately connected. So you've got that. Then you've also got the kind of the nature being this place of freedom and creativity. So it takes place in the valley's wild, and that word wild is not a negative word. It's to do with the nature, the kind of natural wildness of creativity. And then towards the end, again, it's not a coincidence that the pen that writes this book is made of a hollow reed, and the ink has been stained with clear water. So again, we've got this idea of the natural imagery being really intimately connected to the kind of creativity in the poem. So I think those are the two things. The third thing I guess you might want to look at is that idea of the divinity of children. So on a cloud I saw a child. This is not a normal child, is it? This child is an angel. But you might kind of say that like the idea of children being angelic and children being divine is another kind of really clear motif in Blake. So I would say in terms of methods, you've got three key sets of imagery there to be talking about with this poem. So hopefully that makes sense. Just quite quickly, we can have a look at a critical viewpoint. So John Higgs, who's one of my favourite writers about Blake, his biography is probably my favourite one. He just gives us that kind of context that helps understand where this is coming from. So I'll just read out the critic and then we can think about how we might use that. So Songs of Innocence is well named. Many of the 19 poems are written from the perspective of children and capture the sense of wide-eyed, open-hearted wonder, as yet undamaged by the realities of the world. Just first of all, that wide-eyed, open-hearted wonder is a nice quote that you could pick out to say that Higgs is presenting that Higgs is saying that Blake presents these poems with that. I think you've got that wide-eyed, open-hearted wonder, haven't you, in this relationship between the speaker and the child in the poem. This in itself was unusual. Children's books at the time tended to be moralistic. They took the form of an adult voice instructing children on correct behaviour. So there's the context that I mentioned earlier. In contrast, Blake described a world of play and delight infused with the message that spiritual beings are watching over all children, so they have nothing to fear. And again, you've got those words play and delight, which really fit in with this poem. If you just quickly go back to the poem, maybe, the piping down the valley as well, the pleasant glee is linked to that idea of play and delight, isn't it? The child weeping with joy in the third stanza, and then the happy songs that every child may joy to hear in the final idea in the poem. All of that is kind of building this idea of the world of play and delight. So that's what I'd say about the Songs of Innocence, about the Song of Innocence. We'll have a look at some writing about this later, but I think maybe a good activity for you to do is, if you pause the video before I continue, what you might want to do is have a go at the question on the slide here. How are children presented in the introduction to the Songs of Innocence? Could you write a paragraph where you brought together everything that I've just said? You might use Higgs as your critic. You might bring in that idea of this being quite different in terms of your context, and you might bring in those elements of how should we put it? The different three strands of imagery for your AO2. So if you want to pause it now and have a go at answering that question, I'll continue and I'll show you an example for the other poem. Okay, so hopefully you've paused it and come back. Let's just quickly have a look at the Songs of Experience. It might just be worth thinking about the idea that for context, you could always from memory just bring in how very different the artwork looks. So going back to that Song of Innocence, Blake often uses vines, doesn't he, in his Songs of Innocence, and this in the Songs of Innocence it's very light, and these vines, which are often about growth and development, aren't they? A lot of his child poems include kind of stems and vines and things like that. But look at the introduction to the Songs of Innocence. It's darker, isn't it? You've got that dark blue wash. You've got the stars. This seems to be taking place at night. It's more dreamlike. And maybe that links in with what I was saying at the beginning about context. That even just from the kind of colours that Blake is using in his artwork, you can see that we've got maybe a more mature kind of idea of that. So with the introduction to the Songs of Experience, what I thought I'd do, rather than kind of going through, is just to show you an example of what I would write about. So if I try and read there from Blake's artwork, I'll just read the poem, and then it says, aim to write 4 or 5 sentences. How is Blake's introduction to the Songs of Experience different to his introduction to the Songs of Innocence? Well, we've got something really different. Hear the voice of the bard, who present, past and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walks among the ancient trees. The light's just gone off in this room, I'm just going to move them. Sorry, I'm obviously sitting too still. Whose ears have heard the holy word that walks among the ancient trees. I mean, you can tell right from the register of that poem that it's very different. Rather than a piper, we've now got a bard. So a bard is a kind of maybe more mature poet than just kind of this piper. And we definitely got kind of bigger ideas than just this child being happy, haven't we? This piper, if it's the same character, has turned into a more mature figure. So the piper's job in the introduction to the Songs of Innocence was just to play happy songs to make children happy. This one is making a much bigger claim. Listen to me, because I can see the present, past and future. I have heard the holy word. I am a prophet now, is the claim in this poem. So the speaker of this poem has, I guess, grown up, if you want to put it that way, and certainly become more complicated. And what is he doing? What do we need to listen to? There's that command at the start of the poem, hear the voice of the bard. Well, he's calling the lapsed soul, weeping in the evening dew, that might control the starry pole, fallen like we knew. O earth, return, arise from out the dewy grass. Night is worn, and the morn rises from the slumberous mass. Turn away no more, why wilt thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore is given thee till the break of day. So this is a prophet who is saying, listen to me, and we will regain the fallen world. The Songs of Experience are often about how the world is a corrupt and fallen place. Nobody is being blamed in this one, as Blake often blames the church, doesn't he, or the king, or the other kind of institutions. No one's being explicitly blamed here. It's a bit more hopeful, in fact. It's saying, yes, the world is fallen, the world is slumbering, but the earth can return and arise. So it's almost like a call to arms, this, isn't it? And it's saying, now you need to read the Songs of Experience, and it's not just about making children happy anymore. It's about reclaiming the world from its fallen and corrupt state. So just to finish off, I'll show you what I've written, and that just summarises the things that I've said, and I'll show you some examples of how you might use AO2 as well. So Blake's introduction poem seems to give the poet or bard a kind of spiritual power over the reader, and the voice of the poem is asking the reader to listen and the earth to rise up out of its sleep. The world has become a kind of corrupt or lapsed place, and the poem speaker seems to be calling earth to rise up again into the light of innocence. Like its counterpart from Songs of Innocence, this poem explicitly sets Blake or his piper or bard up as a kind of prophet who has heard the word of God. However, this poem is different from the other poem's purpose of simply providing joy to children. It also sets a darker and perhaps more serious tone for the rest of the collection, moving away from the childlike innocence of the previous one. So that's just my little summary of kind of what I picked up from the imagery that from when I just read the poem out there. And looking at maybe doing some analysis as well on the next slide. In this poem, Blake uses the contrasting imagery of day and night to symbolise a kind of waking up to the speaker's prophecies. In the third stanza, night is worn and the morn rises from the slumberous mass. The contrasts of night and morning, along with rising and slumbering, give us the sense of a battle between two opposing forces, which we know that Blake was really interested. Without contraries, there is no progression, says Blake, doesn't he, in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So we know that Blake understands the world in terms of these forces. In this poem, the opposite forces are night and day, which kind of stand for almost good and evil, really. There's a pattern of commanding language throughout the poem. Hear the voice, arise, turn away no more, to make it clear that the speaker of the poem is calling upon the lapsed soul and the earth to rise up and follow the holy word. It possibly feels like a warning or at least an encouragement. Here Blake is making a bigger claim for the powers of the bard than he did in the poem's previous counterpart. Instead of simply being made for the entertainment of children, these poems are being presented as instructions from the Holy Spirit for mankind to rise up to spiritual awakening. So what I've tried to do there is to just give you a little bit of a summary of how you might talk about either these two poems individually, or ideally in a 40-mark question, you'd want to talk about them together as a pair, because they work together as a pair, don't they? And they represent progression through those conjuries between the piper who is celebrating art and celebrating music and just using his art and music in order to make children happy, progressing to a more mature artist or musician who is not just making children happy, but is actually giving you instructions for how to save the world and the soul of the world. We'll leave it there.